I started using Reason in 2005, and I am absolutely head over heels in love with the Reason drum machine. So I'm going to jump into Reason right now. Sound design inside of Reason itself. Anyways, for those of you who do not know Reason, the program is designed to be like hardware. So what you see up here is it's a unique format. It's totally unique to any other program. I mean, Ableton, Cubase, Logic, and FL, they all have their similarities. This one is totally unique on its own in the sense that it doesn't accept VSTs. Well, actually the new version does, but I mean, that's a total convoluted party in itself. I'm not even gonna go there. But anyways, I have my main mixer up top here, and down below here I have this unit called the Combinator. Anyways, it's not really relevant, but the Combinator isn't relevant. But inside the Combinator I have another mixer. It's a 16-channel mixer, and this unit here is the drum computer. It's a drum machine, and that's step sequencer based, like you can see down there. And so yeah, so basically how it works is you just load each unique drum sample into each channel on this drum machine here, and I have all my drums loaded up. So when it comes to drums, I mean, there's two different ways you can go about it. You can either synthesize your own drum hits with a synth. If you love it and it just like makes you feel orgasmic inside, synthesize your drums, go for it. Personally, it's not for me. There's a lot of really awesomely talented sound designers out there who are making really good samples. So I'm a bit of a sample connoisseur. I'm constantly finding the newest, best quality samples I can find. And I highly recommend you adopt that as a practice for yourselves there too. Be like over the top stickler with how quality of samples are. There's a quote in the audio world that's you can't polish a turd. And it's totally true with any piece of audio. If it sounds like shit coming right out of the gate, I mean, yeah, you can do some processing and kind of make it sound okay, but it's an uphill battle, and it's not even worth your time or energy. So if you can find those really nice, high-quality samples right off the get-go, then you're winning. You're winning already. So for kick drums, that's where I start when I make my drums. My go-to sample pack right now is the Black Octopus Sound Monster Kick sample pack. I cannot recommend it enough. So for snares, I'm a bit of a snare connoisseur. When I said I used to struggle with my drums, snare was by my weak point. My snare is so wimpy, and just everybody knows having that nice, challenging, punchy snare is so important. So for snares, I found that the Vengeance dubstep sample pack actually was highly recommended to me by people I highly respect, and the snares in there are totally awesome. So I highly recommend those. So there's also Thomas Penton drum samples, and these ones are actually really starting to get really well known too. And the Thomas Penton drum samples, and they're just sexy as hell, and it's anything you could possibly imagine. There's bongos, congas, the cymbals are great, especially the crashes. A lot of the crashes aren't too invasive, and a lot of crashes I find in sample packs are really distorted. So yeah, they're really nice and really gentle, but also really powerful, and add this beautiful brightness and sparkle. I can't recommend the Thomas Penton samples enough. They're weapons, total weapons. And the percussion folder itself, the big drums and hits, there's like big, huge cinematic drums that are really awesome. Yeah, like I said, I can't shut up enough about them. I also got this other sample pack that's called Sounds in HD. And it's just drum hits, and they're recorded with the highest quality microphones on the planet, basically. So yeah, so any of these, the kicks, the percussion, the hi-hats especially, they're beautiful. So I highly recommend that as well. If you guys want to touch base with me after this, just send me a message or an email, and I'll send you a message of all my references. And actually, something that I'm going to do for everybody who's attending this talk is if you send me your email, I'll send you a little care package with a small handful of my favorite kicks, my favorite snares, hi-hats, and everything. I'll send you the kicks and snares out of all the tunes that I've done this past 6 months or so. So yeah, you'll get this nice little awesome sexy drum package coming at you. So anyways, let's get right into it here. So typically with drums in the past, I've layered my drums like crazy, like crazy. Like we're talking 3 different kicks, and and a handful of different snares, and I haven't done that here for the kick. I'm so over the top pleased with how the Black Octopus Monster Kicks pack is that you don't layer it. So yeah, I find that just the hit is just beautiful and punchy enough, and if I add anything else to it, it just kind of degrades the audio a bit. So yeah, that's how much I stand by these kicks. So I highly recommend it. The snares, on the other hand, so a lot of these things too, I'm going to kind of relate to. I bet you everybody here uses a different method or a different program. So I mean, like, what is there? There's Ableton, Reason, Cubase, Logic, FL Studio. Everybody's got something different. So I'm gonna try to do this in a way that speaks to everybody all at the same time, because I know a lot of I know pretty much every technique that I do, you'll be able to do in your own program. So if you have questions about that, I do know Ableton moderately well. I know Reason well. I know Cubase really well. Cubase is my workhorse DAW. I just do my drum design in Reason, and I know FL Studio a little bit. So if you have any questions and you want me to relate it specifically to your program, I invite that too, and I will answer it as best as possible. Okay, so that's the kick that I've used here, and I haven't done anything else to it. It's just that raw kick, and I stand by it. I love it. Okay, so the next step in the drum pattern is the snare. Okay, so I'm just going to play you what it sounds like here. That's everything all together. Okay, so there's the kick just like by itself, like I said, and so the next step is the snare. So from the Vengeance sample pack, I've taken that from here. So there's this knob here on the drum machine. It's called length, and in your respective programs, it might look like something decay, sustain, or release. The length knob on the Reason drum machine is basically a release and sustain knob, all tied into one. So it just brings it from a really long sample to really short. Okay, so there's the raw sound, and you can hear that kind of white noisy tail happening there. So that's why I turn the length down, because I really love the transient, the snap of the drum. And when I say transient, what transient means by definition is a burst of energy. So if you can see here, I'm going to zoom in here. So this is a drum hit waveform. Okay, so the transient, that initial burst of energy, happens pretty much right at the very beginning of the drum hit, and then you kind of get this long drawn out tail at the hit. Okay, so the core of your audio energy right there in the transient, that's going to be the most important piece that we're working with here when it comes to good quality punchy drums. Focus the most of your energy on the transients. Like you heard, if you can hear it clearly in the sample of that snare, you can hear that white noisy tail, and things like that, I cut them out all the time, unless I'm doing it on purpose. But for this in particular snare drum, I just like that initial punch on the transient. So I turn the length % there. So I've just isolated just the punch. Okay. So how that sounds with the kick drum put together, it's kind of nice sounding and it's really punchy, but it's not beautiful and lush and warm. So I've added some extra layers here as well to the snare. So I just snipped out just the transient from that one drum, and in my next drum here, I have a little bit more of an open, kind of wispy, it's almost like a beatbox type snare. So when you add those together, you get that initial kind of more dry, distorted, punchy snap of the first transient to that nice wispy white noisy that I've added on my own in a controlled environment. As you can see here too, if you can see this knob clearly, I've also got the length knob at about 45%. So it's also short, has a shortened envelope too. Okay, so the next step here, that's a snap. That's just like a finger snap. Okay, so I actually have two of them in my drum machine, and what I've done is I have one panned hard left and the other panned hard right. Okay, so that gives it the snap a little bit of this beautiful stereo effect. Okay, what I've also done here is you can see this pitch knob. I've off-pitched them a little bit too. So I have one detuned by 5 microtones, and I have the other one detuned up by about 11. So it just gives them like this, with them panned and them pitched off from each other, it creates this beautiful stereo effect. So I highly recommend doing that with hi-hats. It works awesome for hi-hats. It also works really great for vocals. If you're ever doing any vocal processing in any of your tune, have two different tracks and detune them slightly. And pan one to the left and one to the right, and it creates this beautiful lush effect. You can, the sky's the limit with this technique actually. If you are doing any baseline processing too, and let's say you have a really popular method of doing baseline processing is have one track that is the low end, has just the low end of your bass line isolated, and the other one that has just the top end isolated. So on the top end, you don't want to do this on your low end because you want to keep that dead center and mono for your bass. But for the top end of your bass lines, if you pan one to the left, one to the right, and high pass filter it so you're just getting the high end, top end stereo audio information in there, and you try the same technique, it works. It sounds beautiful too. So just play with it a little bit and find a sweet spot that works for you in your production. But yeah, when it comes to adding a nice little layer to your snare, you can do this with a clap. I've chosen a snap, and I'm just going to show you how that sounds all together here. I have my transient, my wispy white noise, and I have that stereo snap all layered over each other. And to me, it sounds really good. And that's why I chose to stick with it with this particular tune. These drums are the drums that I did for my remix of Vesper's I Love Go-Go Dancers tune that came out on Adapted Records on New Year's Eve. And yeah, so it's one of my favorite sets of drums that I've done personally, so it's the ones that I'm working with for this lesson. It's mostly the kick and snare that are the most important. So this is just kind of a rhythmic hi-hat loop. And this is just kind of a off-kiltered step there for that hi-hat. So anyway, so that's how I've done my drum design. If you're using Ableton, I highly recommend using Ableton's drum rack. You can do all these exact same layerings over each other. Personally, the reason why I use redrum still is because something that every music program has is called, it's something within the program itself, internally, mathematically in the program. It's called summing. So what summing is, it's how the program mathematically adds sound together through the mixer into the master channel. Okay, so it's how things come out the master channel. That's summing. So one thing that's really important to know is that not all summing is created equal. This is why I use the redrum, is because I love how it mathematically adds sound together. I don't know exactly how, algorithmically speaking, I don't know the formulas, I'm not the software designer, but what I do know is I love how it sounds. And I guarantee you, if I was to run this exact same drum chain through Cubase, Logic, Ableton, or FL Studio, it would sound different in every program, even if all the levels were matched. Okay, so yeah, so at this stage in the game, I've done my sound design, I've got my kick, and I've got my snares and how I've layered them all up. So that's where I'm at right now. So my drums are designed. So I'm just gonna close that, and I do the rest of my production in Cubase. So I'm just gonna open up Cubase here. It'll just be about a minute. Does anybody have any questions so far? This is a good time while Cubase is doing its thing here. Just go ahead and type a question in the chat window. All right, nobody has any questions? Okay.
Sorry, man, I was just looking for the chat.
Yeah, okay, for sure. Yeah, no worries, man.
Okay, I found it. Sorry, man.
Luke has asked me if I EQ the various sound layers. And in Reason, I don't. And the reason why I don't is because the summing of the mixer itself is so solid that it pretty much blends the sounds seamlessly. Now, one thing to pay attention to, one thing that does become obvious, is one thing that you might have noticed in my drum design in Reason is that I have my low-end snappy transient, and I'm looking for the low end on that. The low end is so important. A lot of the tunes that I get sent by other producers, and even tunes that I get sent for mastering, they have like this really high-end, toppy, almost clap type sound to it, and it's lacking that punch. So the reason why I chose that one particular snare is for the low-end punch. Now, beyond that, the next snare was that wispy white noise that sounded like a beatbox. That layer is totally separate. I mean, tonality speaking, from the snare, from that low-end transient snare that I had first, and ditto with the snap. And the way that those different sounds blend together sounded really awesome to me. Didn't need any work. But I mean, let's say you were to add two snares together that have a lot of low-end information. In that scenario, I would do some EQing. In that particular project file, I didn't have to, just because of the way that I chose the sounds in advance. I mean, I was strategic in the sense that I didn't choose sounds that were in the same frequency space altogether all at the same time. And it's just something that I've learned to be proactive about. I mean, that's another thing that I should mention. This is more of a mixing thing, but I'm just going to mention it since it's relevant anyways. I get a lot of tunes sent to me for mastering, or just producers asking me to hear their music, and a lot of they're choosing sounds that are all in the same frequency space. So if you're choosing a bass line and you have a synth riff that's not necessarily a bass line, but it's in the lower octaves, you're going to obviously get some crystal clear frequency clashing there happening. And the way that I've chosen my sounds in advance doesn't allow for that to happen. This is Cubase. For those of you who don't know it, this is where I do 99% of This is where I do 99% of my production, and I'm going to stop before just answer Richard's question here. Or Justin's got a question too. Okay, so Justin, for 808 kicks, I do have a sample pack. I do have a sample pack with a lot of great 808 kick drums. I don't use it a lot, so I don't remember off the top of my head what it is. But if you send me your email address, I'll happily include a lot of the best ones in the sample. So Richard has asked, if I'm going for a house beat, would I still use those same samples? And the answer is no. And the reason why the answer is no is because with a house beat 4x4, you have that kick drum that's constant, right? So the second snare that I chose has lots of low-end information on it. So as you can see, I'm gonna open it up here just so you can see clearly. My snare track right here that I have, and this is the frequency analyzer that I use. It's made by a company called Melda. It's like Zelda, but with an M instead of a Z. And I highly, this is like my #1 go-to plug-in tools. The total Melda bundle is just over the top spectacular. And one of my personal favorites of the pack is the frequency analyzer. I've used probably about 8 or 9 different frequency analyzers, and a lot of them have been hard to read, hard to understand, and this one is just like so golden and too good to be true. So I'm just going to show you here. Okay, so that's my snare, and it's telling everything that I have going on in my snare here, beautifully. And as you can see here, this is where the peak on the low end is, and where I have my mouse pointed over, it tells me the exact hertz and frequency, and it also tells me the key. So right now where my mouse is, where the peak of that snare drum was, is at 210 hertz, which is a G sharp note, and it even tells you what level it's at. So over here, I've got a high-end peak at 8.9 hertz. So yeah, it is so precise and so specific. Yeah, it's great. So something that I'm really anal about during my drums and my mixing process is keeping an eye on things through a frequency analyzer. Hey, whoever has your mic on, can you just turn it off for a second? Can you keep your mic off unless you have a question, then you can turn it back on. Yeah. So anyway, so I'm gonna get into a little bit of what I do from a mixing standpoint to add just a little bit of extra pep, of extra punch to drums. Okay, so this is the exact same drum loop as I had going in Region. So I take a look at my kick drum, and the peak of the audio energy, where the peak energy of the transient is at 54 hertz. So that's really, really valuable information. So one thing that I'm going to note here too is this is less getting punchy drums and more of making a harmonious musical tune. But at 54 hertz is the peak of my kick drum, and the peak of my kick drum was at in G sharp, and my snare was in G sharp. So that's a harmony thing. So your tune will always sound better. If you have a bass line that's let's say in G sharp, and you have another one that's in whatever note is out of harmony with it, your drums will sound the same. It's just a simple fact. I mean, it sounds better if your sounds are in harmony, and your music is more emotionally moving. And drums are subtle. Drums are subtle, so if they're not in harmony, you might not notice it right away, but how it impacts the listener emotionally, that's where it really comes through. And that's what music is all about. It's all about making it emotionally moving. So keeping your drums in harmony, and this analyzer is a great way to have a measurement of that. Okay, so moving on. So I have my kick drum here, and I found with my analyzer that my peak is at 54 hertz, so the peak of my energy there. So that's where I'm going to spend a lot of my energy on, is on that 54 hertz marks. So I have this EQ here, and it's made by a company called Brainworks. These plugins are fucking awesome. And I mean, for mixing and especially for mastering, they're designed for mastering, but you can use them for mixing as well. Not all EQs are created equal. So what I've done here is, if you can see this here, this is the left channel. It's my mono section, and there's also a stereo section as well here too. So you can influence just the mono and stereo information at the same time with one plugin. It's called mid-side processing. So if you have any more questions about mid-side processing, I could do a whole workshop. I could do a whole 2-hour talk on mid-side processing alone, so I'm not going to go too deep into it. But so the kick information, the low end is mono. Every sub in ever designed is in mono. So doing anything in the low end in stereo is a waste of time, and it's just not going to translate onto a big system, which is what it's all about. So I'm going to focus on the mono information. I've got the 54 hertz selected here because that's where I found where my peak is, self-explanatory. And here, if you can see in the lower window down here, there's a really good it gives you a really good visual of what your Q looks like. It makes it really blatantly obvious. So what I have is a sharp Q select. So it's just a really tight, small area of the frequency spectrum that I'm influencing. And if you can see this knob here, this is the boost, the gain. I've only done a boost of 0.4. Okay, so it's just a little nudge. It is so 0.4, it is so easy to overboost on drums. So you got to be super gentle. And this is the kind of thing that if you're making a tune, and I mean, if you're a DJ or you have some sort of live performance, whether it be an Ableton live set or whatever that looks like for you, everybody knows that the first time you test your tune out on a system is all important. So I mean, that's a good gauge of whether if your tunes are over boosted or not. So I tend to be a little bit more conservative and just give it a little bit of extra nudge, not too much. Okay, so over on the snare front, I did the exact same thing. Okay, so the peak of my energy is at 210 there on the low end there. So I'm going to switch the frequency knob to 210, and once again I've got a sharp Q, and I've only boosted it by 0.7. Now that, if you remember from inside of Reason, that initial tiny micro transient snap that I had that had a lot of low end, it's a powerful punch already. So I don't need to boost it too hard, but I can boost it a little bit. Now the kick drum is a little bit more fragile in terms of boosting. So if I was to boost this kick drum by 0.7, 0.4 and 0.7 could be the difference between a shitload of distortion and crystal clarity. Okay, so I had a couple other questions here. BM, would ever take the freaks out below the lowest transient? Yes, absolutely I would. So on the snare here, good mixing practice is to give every sound in your tune nothing but room to breathe. Give each element needs its space to rock out and do its thing, and have lots of open space to do its thing, so it can really breathe and come through in the mix. Mixing your drums is one of the best ways to do that from a drum standpoint. So I'm going to take a look at the snare. And as you can see here, I have a little bit of information around the 50 hertz mark. It's peaking pretty low. It's at minus 30 decibels. So I have a little bit of low end information on my snare, and I don't need it. The peak of my energy is at 210, and that's the sweet spot, and that's where the punch on the sound system is going to come through. So what I'm doing is I'm just adding unnecessary audio onto my tune. Now, if you take a look at your tune, and let's say I'm talking about like your bass lines and your synths and your build-ups and everything, your hi-hats, especially hi-hats too, because hi-hats can have a little bit of low-end rumble on them as well. If you make a point to take this out, and I recommend using a filter. I don't use an EQ because filters have a sharper cut and they tend to be a lot more accurate and fine-tuned than an EQ. So getting some low-end spikes here. I have a filter that I use, and it's a filter that I've been using since 2005 basically, and I have it. It's still one of my favorite filters. It's free, high pass. It's a high pass filter, and I'm just gonna filter everything from, let's say, 130 and down. So now let's take a look at this. There's a lot less audio information. It was coming up to there before, and now there's a big huge cut that's happened. So I really cleaned up the low end, and that's more of a mixing thing. That's not about drum design. That's more of a mixing thing. So that's why I didn't really emphasize that too much. But yeah, great question, Liam. Good call, man. So that's my kick and my snare. And now, so what I've done here is I have all of my drums on kick my kicks and hi-hats and everything is routed out to this one group. And what that allows me to do is it gives me everything coming out one channel all at once. So the kick, snare, hi-hats all coming out all one channel. So what that lets me do is that lets me throw effects on everything all at the same time. So here's an EQ. That demonstration was just to show you what kind of influence I have in my potential here. Okay, so one of my favorite compressors, and I use this both for mastering, sometimes depends on the tune, and I use this great little compressor called Punch. Okay, and now there's two versions of it. There's Punch, and then there's Punch Evolved. And Punch Evolved is just a little bit more detailed and gives you a little bit more options, and it's 30 bucks. It is one of the best, most cheapest investments I've made. It is such a gem. Okay, so I'm just going to type that in the box here so everybody has a record of it, and I highly, highly, highly recommend picking it up. Punch Evolved. So what you can see happening here, I'm not going to get into too deep of a compression lesson here. This meter here is really important. You can kind of see how the compression's working. You can kind of see how it works with the attack and release. So yeah, with fast, it's a little bit more of like a jackhammer jab type movement, and with it slow, it has a little bit more of a wave and a flow and a roundness to it. And it's that wave and the flow and the roundness, this compressor, its character. The way that I use it, and this you can use on your drum bus with any compressor, is just the character of this compressor that I like, which is why I'm bringing it up and recommending it. So I have my ratio set to 4, so it has, you know, a small amount of compression, but it's still enough to really have that force. That force and that whip that we're gonna get from these attack and release things. So I like the attack to be slow. Now the reason why I like the attack to be slow is compression is a form of gain reduction. It reduces gain. It kind of squishes audio a little bit. Just a brief explanation of how it works. And now the reason why I want a longer attack and I don't want the compression kicking in absolutely immediately. The reason why is back to the transient lesson here. That initial piece of audio energy, I want to preserve that. So if my compression attack is set to 0 and compression is starting exactly at the start of the waveform, and so what's happening is we're going to squish the transient, which means we're going to lose a little bit of energy there. So if I turn up the attack, the compression starts after the transient. So that transient stays snappy, stays full of energy. We're not doing any gain reduction on it, and it also gives us a little bit of a motion to it, a motion to the compression. And so the release is the same way. So as we're seeing on the meter here, with the slow release or with the fast release, as you can see, with the release slow, the compression drops right away. But when you turn up or turn down the release or turn up the release, so it's on a longer setting. So it takes, the attack is how long it takes for the compression to kick in, the gain reduction, the audio squishing to kick in, and the release is how long it takes to let it go and go back to its original audio. Okay, so if it's fast, the compression kicks in and kicks out right away. But with a slow release, it takes a little bit longer for the compression to go back to its normal energy level. So what I find with a slow attack, not too fast a release, but enough. It's really subtle, and like I said, you need good monitors to be able to hear this really clearly. A lot of people work on headphones or some lower end monitor, it's a little bit more challenging to hear what's actually happening here. But with these compression settings, a long slow attack and a short release, it gives you like this whip, 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 whip. And it's deadly if you can get it nailed right. And it's all about using your ears too. I mean, you don't want to overdo it. So you can use compression almost like an instrument in itself. You're not using it to squish it. You're using it to kind of give it a little bit of a texture to and a little bit of motion and whip to your drums. Okay, so Richard asked, do I usually high pass my kick? No, I don't really. Sometimes I do. Sometimes I do. Like what I'll tend to do is I'm gonna take a look at my hi-hats here for a second. Okay, so I'm just gonna pick one. Okay, I'm gonna go with this one just because I like it. Okay, so as you can see, as you can see here in the analyzer, my hi-hat is peaking around 13K. So what I'll do is I'll take this is a common EQ, so that's just why I picked it. So I'm going to go to 13K. And if I do a cut on my kick drum at 13K, what I'm doing is I'm giving my hi-hat their own space in the mix to breathe. Like I said earlier about mixing, great mixing is all about giving each its own space to breathe. So in that instance, I would, and that's something that I do at the end of my production cycle when I'm making a tune. When I'm making a tune, my flow tends to go get all of my creative ideas out first, as fast as possible. I'm pretty sure everybody who's listening, if you've made at least one tune, can relate to this. That creative flow is precious and needs to be harnessed as much as possible. Creative flow, it's not always there. I mean, everybody experiences writer's block, which is just like a total absence of creative flow. So the creative flow, I look at it like surfing. Okay, so if you're surfing and let's say you catch a sick wave and it's just fucking awesome, and you have this crazy wave and you're just rocking it, and then you jump off early just because you want to go do something else. It doesn't happen, right? If you are catching a sick wave, you need to ride that bitch as long as possible and right to the very end. And the same goes for creative flow. So mixing is a skill. It's a technical skill. It's like riding a bike. It's something you can do anytime, no matter what. So yeah, gotta harness your creative flow. So this is something I do at the end of my mixing cycle. I kind of finish off with this punchy drum tutorial with something else that's really common called parallel bus compression. Now this is a really old production technique, and you're able to use it for drums, vocals. You can actually use it for bass lines too if you want. I don't suggest using it for bass lines unless you absolutely and utterly know exactly what you're doing and you're listening on really good monitors and you can hear things really clearly, so you can hear pristinely exactly what you're doing. Makes things sound big and full if it's done properly. Okay, so in Cubase I have something called an effects channel. In Ableton it's called a send and return. So it's muted right now. I'm not sure if you can see that. It's muted right now, so it hasn't been present yet in what I've been doing. But what I have happening here is I have EQ set up and I have a few boosts happening. Okay, so I have my 54 hertz boost, which is where my kick drum is peaking. I have my 204 hertz boost, which is where my snare drum is peaking. And these are boosted like a motherfucker. They're boosted by 6 decibels. So that's a huge boost. Okay? Explain why I did a huge boost here in a second, because before I told you to go light, and I understand that's probably contradictory. So I have another boost here at about 10 kilohertz. Okay? So now what I would be more inclined to do is just so I'm keeping my boosts in harmony. And now this is a technique called a harmonic EQing. And this is something that I would teach in more of a mixing workshop, but I'm just going to bring it up now because it's kind of relevant. So harmonic EQing, as I showed you before, my kick was in G sharp and my snare is in G sharp. So my kick and snare are in harmony. Now with harmony, when it comes to EQing, it's wise to do any boost that's in harmony with your tune. So do your boosts in this tune, I'll do my boosts on my G sharps, and I'll do my cuts in places that are not in harmony. So like something like A sharp B flat, like that note for sure is not in key with my tune, and I know that. So if I do a cut at A sharp, and it would be a sharp Q cut, a sharp EQ cut, not a more rounded Q, but it'd be a very sharp notch. It's called a notch cut. I would do a notch cut on my A sharps, and what I'm doing is I'm taking out energy that's not in harmony with my tune, leaving in energy that is in harmony with my tune. So in the context of this parallel bus compression, I'm going to take a look around the 10 kilohertz mark for G sharp. So that's at 13, exactly where that hi-hat is. And I've tuned my hi-hats in my tune in this track here as well, so all my hi-hats are in G sharp as well. So I'm going to change this to 13K. So now as you can see, 6 decibel big boosts right there, and I have a 4 decibel boost at 13K. Okay, so now I boost these a lot because now I'm going to compress the shit out of it. Okay, so I have a huge boost, so I'm boosting the energy there, and now I'm going to bring it back down again. Okay, Now, it sounds kind of like a weird technique, but what that gives you is it gives you kind of this flattened but boosted signal. Okay, so now what's going to happen here is I have my drum group, which is all the processing that I've showed you up to now. But now that I have this send and return happening, this parallel bus compression track, what we're doing here, it's also called the New York City compression. That's this slang street gangster lingo. So what we have happening here is we have the original dry signals and this Kuiper boosted and compressed signal all layered over top of each other. So what we're going to get now is a blend of the original drums and a blend of this smashed signal. So back to being muted. On. It really beefs up your drums when done correctly. So one thing that's really important to know about parallel compression is you got to turn the channel all the way down and then slowly bring it up. And you want to do that so you can slowly just gently test the waters little bit, decibel by decibel by decibel, to get it in the sweet spot. Everybody here knows that whenever you tweak anything in music production, whether it be an EQ or an LFO or any sort of parameter on a synthesizer or a plugin, it's all about finding the sweet spot. It's kind of like a vagina. You got to find the sweet spot.